further ado, let's start with part one this week in Bitcoin. So, as I've covered in previous shows, you'll notice that I've been sharing how with the Trump administration, even before the election, I was saying that people need to vote for him, despite the fact that there is a lot I don't like. There are vital things that I do like. And one of them is the attack vector of the self-sovereignty of being able to own your own Bitcoin by adjusting countries into a game theoretical scenario that leads to an eventual Bitcoin standard. And secondly, the fact that we can have a speculative attack on fractional reserve banking and a deleveraging controlled demolition by moving to a stablecoin standard. Now, a stablecoin standard, as you know, is swapping one evil for another evil, but it's an incremental controlled demolition that can happen in a way more peaceful way at the same time as the geopolitical section correcting all the wrongs of the proof of weapons network in the past, the fiat currency financial terrorists that have caused so much problems in the world by creating a debt-based Ponzi scheme. Now, that debt-based Ponzi scheme relies upon, at layer one, the central banks. At layer two, the intelligence agencies, which are essentially the mob, the gangsters, that don't have national security in mind, but do everything about protecting corporate interests and creating and trafficking drugs, sex trafficking, weapons trafficking. If you watch things like Operation Gladio, if you've read those books, which I recommend, you'll understand that intelligence was created in order to take and, governmentalize many of the worst crimes against humanity. And then layer three, you have governments and you have the installation of puppets, which are there in order to do the bidding of layer one and layer two. And so one of the things you need to do, take away the power of layer one, is remove the gateway drug, which is debt. And a slow transition away from debt is moving away from a fractional reserve banking system, which is a slow confiscation of wealth and the indebtedness of governments that gets them bigger and bigger through war, death, and destruction, through funding massive weapons networks and war networks, and which is designed into the system, and slowly transitioning it with full reserve. Now, it's not perfect, but full reserve is capitulated or created, in essence, from an innovation that came from Bitcoin, which is stablecoins. And stablecoins are like digital ways of sending a dollar or a fiat currency around the world on top of a blockchain. It is backed by US treasuries or government debt, but it is fully reserved. It is not fractional reserved. It is not banks creating money every time they issue a loan in a debt-based Ponzi scheme that cannot be repaid. It is fully reserved. Now, that does mean that you can weaponize government, of course, but it is a incremental step in the process. And I'm going to be going through why what happened in the last week or so is some very important updates in how you can accelerate that process or kind of create a stable coin that just allows banks to commit crime cheaper and perpetuates the same system. Or we can actually give everybody a tool because, the central banks have essentially wiped out middle classes all around the world, but a tool that middle class can use in combination with Bitcoin in order to fight back against the oppressive nature of the proof of weapons network and fiat currency. So, as I've said, the US is slowly moving towards a stablecoin standard. And Europe, as I've said, is kind of a beta test for communism on a blockchain. Let's call it a technocratic totalitarianism. I don't like using the word communism all the time because it is a brutal regime, an ideology that always fails. But, it is a word that people understand. And 1984 authoritarianism in a debt-based Ponzi scheme that gives more and more central banks power is a form of communistic, which is what the Federal Reserve gold was. Is how it took America from 1913, from about 250 million in debt to $37 trillion in debt, plus the $250 trillion of committed liabilities that it has. It makes the government bigger, and it creates the distortions that the proof of weapons network is trying to figure out how to deal with. But of course, we know a Ponzi scheme is a Ponzi scheme. And so you can take it in different directions to try and roll it over. But the end result is that you have more and more centralizing control, whether it be technocratic banks or whether it be technocratic companies in a stablecoin standard, or you just go full-blown authoritarian and centralized with a central bank digital currency. So in October this year, the digital euro launched, and the euro, the CBDC in Europe, is the beta test for what the rest of the world might be able to get away with. In the meantime, it's the 1984 in Europe, basically surveillance state. And you commit, if you watch, if you've read the book Operation Gladio, you'll know that the whole idea is to create strategic tension so that you can fear people through false flag operations executed by MI6, CIA, Mossad, and various other intelligence networks in order to create a surveillance state, change laws, and then perpetuate the criminal networks that funds all of the intelligence class and uses the central banks in order to siphon off money in the layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. But anyway, it's all about this stablecoin and CBDC standard. While we do get a little gift of crowding out fractional reserve banking slowly with full reserve banking over time, depending on what laws and what protections the proof of weapons network, the regulators put in place. In the end, these are two coins of the same thing, but slightly different. One is you're controlled by billionaires that have all the social credit scores, all the data. The other is you're controlled by the proof of weapons network. Both kind of lead to the same thing because the proof of weapons network co-opts the billionaires. And therefore, billionaires like Elon Musk, they get access to military technology, but they still have to do the bidding. And then they have to wipe it in a flag of entrepreneurship to make Americans think that they got a different model, when really they got a similar model to what we have in Europe. But Europe is a bit more, covert about it. And then China is just full covert, and everyone's kind of more efficient because they just know what their government is. Whereas if you go along those different models where Europe is kind of, a covert operation moving to overt, you have and in America, it's like full covert operation, but they're all kind of the same model and the networks all connect into these centralizing forces. In the end, anyway, it is about handing over more and more economic power to banks, to artificial intelligence, to the Trump administration in the case of who's connected to the stablecoin standard. In the case of Europe, the European Central Bank. Technocrats are going to be building these social credit scores. Elites, banks, financial institutions, all of those, if you've watched my video on how the proof of weapons network operates, and if you haven't watched it, go to my YouTube channel, go back and watch it. I dug it out from the middle of one of these episodes. And you can check it out there. Just search Simon Dixon Proof of Weapons Network on my YouTube channel. Well, anyway, the transition to this stablecoin standard is moving at a rapid pace. So Bo Hines, which is the Presidential Council of Advisors for Digital Assets, he came out and said that stablecoin legislation is imminent. Expect it on the president's desk in 2 months. And so, this is essentially the legislation by which tech giants are going to be able to slowly take their chunk of the dollar and back it by treasuries and slowly take some of the power away from the Federal Reserve System and almost have a neo-monetary stroke fiscal policy, which is a radically different model as we transition to this. Why? Because through de-dollarization, foreign governments don't want to be weaponized through the dollar anymore. Because the proof of weapons use sanctions, covert regime change, war, death, destruction. In fact, over the last couple of 100 years, killed 300 million people to prop up the dollar through all of these covert wars, overt wars, and everything that backs up the proof of weapons network that made the British pound that was created from the Bank of England over to the Federal Reserve and the US dollar has killed 300 million people in order to prop up that system globally. And because of that, people are de-dollarizing and they don't want to give power to the dollar. And they're recognizing that there are shifts, and the global capital of the proof of weapons network is redistributing its capital to other regions in order to be more diversified, because just like in World War I, it was a transition from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve, and wars were the mechanism for taking all of Germany's gold, Russia's gold, the colonial gold of the British and French empires, and transferring them all across to the Federal Reserve proof of weapons network. It takes its course because it is by definition something you can milk for as long as possible. But when the debt is no longer subscribed to, that becomes the end of the Ponzi and the dominoes start to fall. Now, they create new tools all the time to prop it up, and they create new mechanisms of extracting more value from everyday people and transferring that wealth over to those that are connected to the 0% interest loan by being able to borrow through quantitative easing. Or you have the special subsidy of a bank where you can literally create the dollar every time you issue a loan. And so then you get this super subsidy and you're able to control the flows of cash in order to rig the system by the politicians and lobby everything in your favor to prop up the system for as long as possible. But the stablecoin standard is essentially a tech giant led. And if you look at the military industrial complex, you look at the large companies, the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics, all of their products are now moving to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and they're beta testing that in Gaza, which is, using technology to commit genocide. And that will be the future of the integrations into these stable coins if you can create false flag operations through strategic tension in order to manufacture consent for law changes. And therefore, this is the beta test. Integrate it into stable coins, integrate it into CBDCs, beta test it on Europe, and then bring it to America, and then consolidate that when eventually the Ponzi scheme collapses and you can replace it with one currency. That's the end, of this. And there is a resistance against that in 2008 in Bitcoin. And then also those that are operating off non-debt-based monetary systems. But they also get corrupted and lead to authoritarianism, kind of the different models that are happening down the BRICS corridor as well. Anyway, it's a tech giant led, and obviously they have all the data. So economies are re-collaborating around this new ecosystem that's being built in order to have a programmatic dollar, and a system that can lead to this eventual social credit score, one in Europe and one in America. And so in order to progress towards that, the gift we get is the end of fractional reserve banking in a peaceful way. The problem we get from that is we move over to a technocracy and a social credit score. You're replacing one evil with another, but it gives you more time to use the system if you're watching Bitcoin Hard Talk in order to exit the system by accumulating as much Bitcoin as possible and using the financial weapons of mass destruction to understand the game and use the programmatic money to end up with more Bitcoin. And then you have a resistance against the full command and control money, using money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply backed by the largest proof of work 800 exahashes distributed supercomputer that Bitcoin gave to us in order to resist against it. Well, anyway, there were a couple of big drops anyway. One of them was the Stable Act, and the Stable Act is essentially the House. And the House is saying, here's a stablecoin legislation. And also at the same time, rather than just the Congress bill or the Congress Act, Senate also advocates for something called the Genius Act. And so you've got these two different bills around stablecoins, a promise that they're going to be done within next 2 months, and probably bipartisan consent. But there is also a banking lobby and a technocrat lobby that wants to ensure that these acts are in favor to their special interest. And I want to make sure that so if you're engaging in the process, you can try and have some of your lobby pressure in order to try and make sure that this system works for us, so that we can actually have this peaceful transition rather than perpetuate the Ponzi scheme by allowing banks to commit crime cheaper using stable coins and social credit scores. But anyway, from these acts, the core features are as follows. The stable coins must be backed by what they call high quality liquid assets, i.e. government debt. You can't have more exotic, you can't have corporate bonds. It must be simple, high grade government debt. That gives governments a tool to borrow, but it also means that they have almost a new monetary policy tool by issuing stable coins and co-opting and allowing the technocrats, the X's of the world, the World Liberty Financials of the world, the Zuckerbergs of the world that will all have their stable coins. You give them a special subsidy in order to cream off the special subsidy from government debt, and most likely they'll convert it to Bitcoin to protect themselves. But if you can actually pass on that yield, and I'll go through a bit more, then you can actually benefit from it yourself and use Bitcoin as a mechanism for making sure that you protect yourself rather than them protect themselves, which is the current model that we have. Anyway, they must be backed by high quality liquid assets. So they must be liquid, as in they're very easy to sell when people want to redeem those stable coins for dollars in their bank. And they gave decentralization or centralization a 2-year head start. There was a 2-year ban on algorithmic stable coins. That is the mechanism by which you could take Bitcoin, for example, and Bitcoin layer 1 allows you to send Bitcoin, own it yourself, send it anywhere, and has a fixed supply so that you can beat the Federal Reserve System, increase your wealth while everyone else is in debt slavery. The layer 2, called Lightning Network, allows you to, through updates, I don't want to get too geeky, but you can essentially launch tokens like stable coins on top of it. And then using algorithmic formulas, you could back it by some of your Bitcoin, take out stable coins against your Bitcoin, and you can do that programmatically, all within self-custody, so that no middleman or bank is needed in the middle. And that is the ultimate place to be. But they want to give the banks and technocrats a 2-year head start before programmatic stable coins are allowed, i.e. they want to perpetuate, they want to make sure that you're addicted to their stable coin, so it becomes very hard to get a programmatic stable coin outside of the system. So there's the first psyop that they're trying to introduce. It's what we're going to be moving to is kind of like free banking era. So pre-1913, we had a free banking era where banks were able to create the dollar, and they had lots of different versions of the dollar until it was centralized into the Federal Reserve System. And banks could create their dollar, and you had a different score kind of with those banks, and they would take different risks. But now they're dishing out stable coins, which is like a full reserve free banking era. It is very disruptive, very, very different. It essentially, is a redistribution of power to those that can issue these stable coins. It's basically digitized full reserve banking, wrapped in kind of a crypto type of close, but it is incredibly disruptive to the fractional reserve banking model. And so the OCC, the regulator of the currency, the Federal Reserve, and the banking cartel that is shareholders in the Federal Reserve will do anything that they can do in order to make a version that allows them to remain in power and remain and having their super subsidy, rather than opening it up to competition, because then you might be able to attack the system and have a real free market, which is the last thing the Federal Reserve wants after over 100 years of bringing America to a wiped out middle class and asset stripping all of the assets away, ready for them to invest in the next global regions and blocks so they can hedge away from America like they did after the Bank of England took over England and got us into all of those wars as well, to gain full control. But anyway, the stablecoin market capitalization as it is today is approximately $214 billion. That's up 63% year on year. It was actually created through a company that I'm a shareholder in, Bitfinex. They purchased a coin I think it was called True USD at the time, if I remember correctly. That became Tether. It was built on top of a layer 2 on top of Bitcoin called Omni. That was originally called Mastercoin. And then they built that layer 2. They built a network for transforming, being able to send dollars around the different exchanges without having to go through the banking system. And then this grew and grew and grew. It's been 63% year-on-year growth. It started when I first, got involved in the industry. It was around about $5 million market cap, and they were trying to get all the exchanges to use it. Now it's $214 billion. But the volume is what's important right now. Now, some of it could be wash trading, and you can't trust various exchanges, but as all of the exchanges are pretty much registered with regulators and wash trading is kind of wiping out in the early days, the transfer volume between these stable coins is now $35 trillion. $35 trillion. That is up 115% year-on-year growth. That means that stable coins now settle more than Visa. Now, in stablecoins, you have larger transactions as well, because it's trivial to send hundreds of millions at the same time as sending $10 as well. But the point is, the amount of volume is now bigger than Visa, which is why Visa is now co-opting the different companies in order to partner and make sure that they're adjusting their business model before they get disrupted through this new stablecoin standard that the Trump administration is delivering and should be on his desk in the next couple of months. And so companies like Stripe, which have essentially a Silicon Valley company, which had created through APIs easy ways of accepting car payments online, they're doing a partnership with Visa, and they're creating a bridge. And they've acquired a company called Bridge for about $1.1 billion, even though it's only done about less than $10 million in revenue. That's because they're going to be moving to this stablecoin standard, which allows all of the tech companies using Stripe to be able to trivially go from stablecoin to Bitcoin through these API rails and merchant processors. Another one, MoonPay. MoonPay just acquired basically for about 100, a company called Iron, and that was for about $100 million or so. And so MoonPay does a lot of crypto. It's more like crypto native, and they're launching their own stable coins. And then from the legacy financial system, Bank of America. Remember the Bank of America that blockaded Julian Assange when he launched WikiLeaks, that was protected by Bitcoin? Well, now they've capitulated and they're getting into stablecoins as well. Now that, of course, Operation Choke Point 2.0 happened in 2022, where the Federal Reserve and the SEC co-opted agents like SBF and Alex Mashinsky, crashed the system, wiped out the crypto-friendly banks like Signature, Silicon Valley Bank, and Silvergate, and then approved the BlackRock ETF so that they could then get all of their buddies into Bitcoin while they shift the world order, knowing that all of the central banks are purchasing more gold. All of the TradFi, traditional financial institutions, global capital that have accounts with BlackRock, they're into Bitcoin. And then they can prepare for the Trump administration, implant Trump, transition to this very disruptive environment that we're going through right now, that shrinks America into a regional power, so that they can get the whole artificial intelligence and robotics in place, while the global finance diversifies into the Middle Eastern bloc, the BRICS bloc, and the various other regions. And I'll cover more of that in macro to help you understand the Trump tariffs when you follow the money. Well, anyway, Bank of America is planning to own their own stablecoin. A company I was an early investor in many years ago, called Circle, they announced that they're doing their pre-IPO rounds now. So they're going to be looking to go public. And I think they're releasing the docs maybe by the end of this month. That might change as a result of the correction in the stock market. And maybe they want to be public before the bills go through, so that, but probably private equity wants to, they want to try and, the pre-IPO tends to do a lot better than the actual IPO. It's like a transfer of wealth from the venture capitalists and the people that invested in private equity, like myself. I don't write the rules. I was just trying to support the industry, but capital takes over. they tend to get the best price, get the right timing, sell it to retail. And then like the Coinbase, which I was an early investor in, they were doing the pre-IPO at about 100 billion, and then it corrected to about 30 billion, and all the retail lose their money, and the wealthy private equity do that. They engineer the system through co-opting the investment banks and overvaluing. But anyway, whatever happens with Circle, we might get that. Pre-IPO transactions are now happening. Essentially, Circle's now, which is one of the second largest stablecoin issuer. Tether co-opted Howard Lutnick from Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald became a shareholder in Tether and started custodying some of the treasuries. And so he got Tether a seat at the table around the White House. Obviously, Brad Garlinghouse, also I was a long time ago, I invested in a company called Ripple Labs. I don't own an XRP, but it was a long time ago. They were creating a network where you could have Bitcoin exchanges connected to each other across Africa, Mexico, global South regions. They ended up going into XRP and kind of working with banks in the end. But I invested early. But now, anyway, they paid their way into sitting down with the Trump administration. And that's why everyone's creating XRP ETFs, XRP futures, because he obviously paid to get Trump in power. And so the lobby power is, politicians are just prostitutes for corporate interest, just as CIA was created to execute proof of weapons violence, just as the Federal Reserve was created to extract wealth from the middle class over to special interests using banks. And banks is a slow confiscation of wealth through a debt-based Ponzi scheme based upon rigging the game through the debt drug and the proof of weapons network. And then you have organizations like IMF that export it globally and create terrorism all around the world that fund these and subdivert these different groups. And then they use that in order to fund the media so that they create these strategic tensions between Republican, Democrats, Labor, Conservative, so that you're always distracted, turning over your politician every 4 years based upon the narrative of the media where they say the left is doing this, the right's doing that. And then you're distracted when they have co-opted both sides and the system just carries on decade after decade, extracting wealth, just as it is under the current administration as well, when we go through the macro section. But they always want you to believe that this time is different, of course, as well. But anyway, the one that paid the big bucks to the Trump administration, they essentially get to, they get their cut of the future of the dollar as we transition to this stablecoin standard. Trump also has carved out a slice of the future of the dollar for his family. So immediately, him and Steve Witkoff was an investor in World Liberty Financial, which is his family, and his family are positioning himself for this new stablecoin standard, Bitcoin standard. And as I always said, follow the money. If you want to get ahead of it, stop listening to what politicians say. All they do is lie, and start looking at what their money is doing, reposition around that, and understand that we're transitioning to a world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs, and get yourself on the right side of the change, because then you can have more economic power to influence those on the wrong side of the change that need your help. And that's kind of what I've always been doing for the last 14 years, and why I still give Bitcoin Hard Talk episodes, even though Bitcoin blessed me with being able to free myself from all corrupted agendas, and because it supported my company, it supported me, and took me to a place I never imagined was possible, thanks to the maths and code. And anyway, World Liberty Financial, they're basically announced they're launching USD1. That is the Trump family slice of the dollar, in order to get their last asset stripping of debt as you roll over the Ponzi scheme, get these stablecoin issuers, and get the super subsidy that goes to the fractional reserve banks and transfer it over to those that have technical companies. So that would be the Trump-backed stablecoin. What else did we get? As I said, Steve Witkoff positioned himself by becoming a shareholder. So all of the people that are transitioning into this world, are all benefiting from this new transition. So just follow the money. And what is Steve Witkoff? He's the new envoy to the Middle East, and he's negotiating what I'll cover in the geopolitical section, the new era in the Middle East. And obviously Trump has massive investments through his family, through the funds that are Saudi funded, and many of that is investing in the other regions as well. Because all of these, they kind of put America MAGA labels and clothes on a globalist agenda to be fully diversified, and that tricks a lot of people. Follow the money and you can stop the tricks. Well, anyway, Steve Witkoff, envoy for the Middle East, negotiating the future of artificial intelligence and energy in the region, and he will be a shareholder in World Liberty Financial alongside the Trump family. Basically, as I said, the president is giving his family programmable power. This is the important side to understand. Whereas in Europe, we're giving it to an unelected European Union and the European Central Bank that is absolutely shafting Europeans by handing over money based upon USAID funded BBC and media to create narratives like Putin is Hitler, to make us put Ukrainian flags and think we're defending democracy, when they're actually just asset stripping all of the assets out of Ukraine, asset stripping all of the Europeans, handing over the money that's being printed, shafting inflation onto those that don't have Bitcoin. They're getting poorer and poorer and poorer while they essentially kill Ukrainians and kill Russians and sacrifice them and make you think that you're the ethical people, while the proof of weapons network, the mafia network, just creates more death and destruction. And in the end, they negotiate the asset stripping of Ukraine. America gets a chunk of the rare earth minerals. Europe gets their chunk. They get to stimulate an economy based upon war, take $350 billion of Putin's money, 800 billion euros, print that, make Europeans smaller, and put those into military contractors where they own the shares as well. And so anyway, the stablecoin providers are looking for programmatic power, because the stablecoin, rather than having the central bank, will hand over to the issuers of stablecoins in America. You know how you always had the Federal Reserve fake capitalism system competing with the engineered communist system through the Soviet Union? You create that strategic tension and you have trillions and trillions of dollars of profits from war after war after war, where you fund both sides. That's exactly what happened. The latest one was the fake war on terror, kind of the Iran-Israel tension. We'll cover more. But now you're getting the stablecoin CBDC tension. The strategy is always the same. Once you recognize it, it's so easy to do. Also, another company I invested in was the largest Bitcoin exchange in Mexico, Bitso. They're creating a peso stablecoin, and that's going to be on a different chain. We also got announcements that Custodia X. Now, remember when the company I co-founded, Bank to the Future, when it first started, we tried to create a full reserve bank. The Bank of England shut it down and said you have to build on top of Barclays. A similar story, Custodia tried to build on top of the Federal Reserve System and give people full reserve bank accounts. In the Biden administration, Operation Choke Point 2.0 shut that down. But in the Trump administration, now we're moving to this stablecoin standard. Custodia X is getting Vantage through Vantage Bank, is getting the first bank-issued stablecoins under a Wyoming charter as well. So they're creating lots of different models. Fidelity, one of the large fund managers, they're getting a tokenized money market fund on top of Ethereum. So basically taking a security that diversifies across these debt instruments, putting them into a fund by pooling together all of the pensioners' money. They get their cut on top of that. Then they build a stable coin on top of it that backs it. And then they get to take the debt-based Ponzi scheme, roll it over into everybody that has Fidelity accounts. So while those de-dollarizing are divesting from treasuries, the bag holders become the everyday American people, the pensions. And if you can allow them to programmatically convert the yield into Bitcoin, they could survive it. But instead, they're making sure that the issuers get to do what Tether does, which is you take the yield and buy Bitcoin, but they're trying to make it so they're protected rather than the people being protected. Of course, Galaxy X, DWS, they're creating a Euro stablecoin. And so they're looking for the competing models within MiCA regulations. After settling with the Department of Justice, Mike Novogratz, who created a fake or was a large pump and dumper in Do Kwon's fake Terra Luna Ponzi scheme, where he said it was a $60 billion Ponzi scheme, where he said, we're creating decentralized central banking through Terra Luna. It was propped up by a shitcoin money printer fiat currency token. And when the token crashed, it led to having to sell down a bunch of Bitcoin, crash the whole Ponzi scheme. And one of the people that benefited from it was Mike Novogratz from Galaxy Digital, where he just paid a $200 million fine. And now he gets to play his role in getting a chunk of the stable coins with the financial terrorists at the European Union and European Central Bank. Now, the states are also getting in as well. Wyoming, which Caitlin Long from Custodia had worked with in order to create regulations around attacking the fractional reserve banking system, the state has come along and saying, we're going to do state banking again. This is very interesting. Before the Federal Reserve System, before the first central bank, the second central bank, the invasion by Europeans in order to co-opt the constitution and replace it with communism on chain, which was always the methodology of perpetuating the proof of weapons network by going around the world and debasing people's currencies, then using organizations like the IMF to get them addicted to debt, and then making them go through radical changes and installing a member bank for the Bank for International Settlements and the economic hitmen that were designed in order to do that. Before those systems, between those systems, America had a state banking system. Well, Wyoming is bringing it back. WYST is looking to launch in July, which kind of looks like a state-run CBDC, but actually done by the state. It is a very different mechanism. And what else? What else is happening? In the last 2 weeks, Sam Altman, the creator of ChatGPT, intelligence technology, you get all of these entrepreneurs in America that essentially are intelligence assets. They create the technology using the military industrial complex. They're used in order to perpetuate it across retail so that we all have to opt into that technology. And Sam Altman launched WorldCoin, which was going around the world, taking the global south countries, getting them to put their iris data, scan it into an eyeball, which becomes their digital ID, and then combine that with artificial intelligence. Well, now Sam Altman's WorldCoin is now talking to Visa in order to create their stablecoin. And of course, Elon Musk is merging X. Now he's got car data. He's got social data through X. He's got Grok, which is XAI. Now he gets to combine it all with Doge. He got all the data from auditing all the different areas of government, whether it be the Pentagon, whether it be USAID and those criminal networks and financial terrorist organizations. He got to be the hero and say Doge is taking out the deep state. But now he gets in exchange the Stablecoin Standard. And really, because he paid the highest price to Trump in order to install Trump as president, he gets to have the social credit score that will power it all. And he gets to be the programmatic winner get the biggest head start, while the 2-year special grace period is given to the decentralizations. But of course, he had to co-opt into the proof of weapons network, and he had to do that in partnership with Visa. So those deals are all being done in the background. Stablecoin on Visa. Visa's perpetuating it across the different systems, and they're making sure that they get their cut. Now, what did Elon Musk come out and say? Well, he said, there was a video I shared on my X. He said, if done right, X would become half of the global financial system. So he has huge aspirations, but this is a front man for military industrial complex technology. He was given NASA's technology. He was able to take Tesla and wipe out the shares of the founder and become the founder. He exited the PayPal mafia, which is with Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's the creator of Palantir. Palantir is creating all the AI technology for doing all the wars with the governments through what's being beta tested in Gaza, genocide as a service. All of these people, they give the backdoors to the NSA, as Snowden told us. As Zuckerberg will, he had to capitulate to the Trump administration. And basically, you get your cut of this stablecoin standard. because it is a stablecoins arms race. Who is in charge right now? Who is the winner? Well, Tether was the number one enemy, but obviously now Howard Lutnick is able to get his share in that. So he's representing Tether, and now Tether is still completely dominating as well. But we're getting kind of the integration of Tether into the US system, when before it was the enemy of the system, because obviously through this network, through Howard Lutnick, through the proof of weapons network, you're able to pay your way into the mafia network as well. So now all of a sudden they can get their audit. So they're in talks with the Big Four in America, the Big Four auditors that sign off on many problematic things, but you get to get the stamp of approval there, because they've now got enough money, because Bitcoin essentially filled any holes that happened when the governments actually seized some of those bank accounts when they were an enemy of the US. Now they're a friend of the US. They filled that hole with Bitcoin, and now they get to be a part of the future of the dollar. The CEO of Tether, Paolo, he now said that they're going to have 200 million. They've got 200 million users right now, and they're aiming for 400 million users. They're going for billions of users by the time you integrate it with these social networks and Facebook and various other things, which was originally what they tried to do with Libra. But then the European, under that administration, they weren't ready for that, because not enough people owned Bitcoin in the traditional network. And so they had to delay it till today. They're also they're playing on the censorship play as well. YouTube used to give me a lot of traffic. I got almost to 100,000 subscribers, and they started censoring me as I revealed these things. Now the administration takes the things that they used to censor me for, because they would call them conspiracy theory, and USAID actually reveals everything. And now they're giving me freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. So please subscribe, like, share. I rely on you. Put a comment in below. But anyway, we're hedging into Rumble, and now Tether made a strategic investment in Rumble, and the Rumble creator monetization is going to be done using Tether. Now, Tether is, out of all countries, in an environment of de-dollarization. Now, this, compared to other countries, the 7th largest buyer of US debt in 2024. And this is what it's about. And this is a subtle detail you need to understand. This is how do we know that we have a tool to fight back, or do we just take the fractional reserve banking system and replace one evil with another email, as everybody's cheering on MAGA saying we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. Essentially, the model of Tether bought 8,888 Bitcoin for approximately $735 million in Q1 2025 alone, just by giving people a digital dollar and buying treasuries, which is taking the debt-based Ponzi scheme that they're rolling over. America has to roll over $9 trillion. You then get the yield from that system, which is perpetuated based upon being able to sell more treasuries. And so you hand over that to the stablecoin issuers, and now you've got a new market to be able to roll over the Ponzi scheme. So based upon that, everybody wants to do what Tether is doing. Trump administration wants to do it. X wants to do it. All of the different players. Visa wants to do it. They want to essentially asset strip the dollar system, take the yield, buy Bitcoin, so that they can then hand over the Bitcoin across globalists. BlackRock can then hedge against the American system while they move to their transition and turn America, which I'll go through in the macro section, into essentially an AI and robotics technocracy based upon the new world order and the new, the wealthy people taking the money that they clipped off America, which was paid for by middle-class Europeans and Americans, and invested into assets across China to BRICS and the Middle East as well. And then that money was reinvested in order to prop up and perpetuate this scheme by combining a debt-based Ponzi scheme with the world capital markets. So if you take Tether alone right now, Tether hodls just through the US government special subsidy, full reserve banking, they managed to get themselves a position of 100,521 Bitcoin worth approximately $8.3 billion and the US government, which is holding about 100,000 Bitcoin, will be returned back to Bitfinex shareholders, which is a sister company of Tether. I was a shareholder in Bitfinex because we supported them when that hack happened to help victims of the hack. Those funds have come back anyway, they get 100,000 Bitcoin based upon that. This is essentially basically asset stripping the remnants of the Ponzi scheme and using stable coins in order to construct financial products, which takes money out of the fiat currency system, hacks it, and creates Bitcoin wealth for those that are able to understand the game. This is what I want you to understand. I want you to be on the right side of this trend. I don't want you to be waving a MAGA flag and be on the wrong side of the trend because you think they're going to hollow out the middle class when all they're doing is handing out assets and asset stripping. And I want people to understand that. And that's a goal that I'd like. Look, maybe they do. Maybe they do what they say they're going to do. The money says no. But if they do, great. But at least prepare for the worst. Because I don't trust politicians. I definitely trust Bitcoin. Why do I trust Bitcoin? Because it's backed by 800 exahashes of energy with no human, with math and code that no one can change. So anyway, last year, Tether were more profitable than Citibank. This is now outstripping fractional reserve banking. There is more money in issuing stable coins and buying Bitcoin than there is in owning and controlling credit and being able to create the digital dollar. So what do you think banks want to do? They want a piece of where the profits are. They also want to hedge. And that's why there was the controlled demolition, and there was BlackRock, one of the global controllers of capital that I talked about in the Proof of Weapons network. They're getting all of their buddies into Bitcoin, and you crashing markets. So you sell your Bitcoin in panic is happy for them because they're buying your Bitcoin and they want to buy it at cheaper because they missed the boat, and they know that there is a global recollaboration of the economy. And what is Citibank doing right now? Citibank is calling the Fed because they need rates to be lower. There was a meeting with Jerome Powell today. He said in the Q&A, we speak with all the banks. It's their shareholders. Citibank is a shareholder in the Federal Reserve System. And so they get to call the banks and say, we need rates to be lower. This debt-based Ponzi scheme needs to come down. You can't control inflation. You need to confiscate more from the middle class because we're over-leveraged and we need you to put rates down right now. Citibank, the European Central Bank, is calling the Federal Reserve because they're both shareholders. The same banks are shareholders in the Bank for International Settlements. The 157 central banks that have to bow down to the violence. And Europe is basically, they're not even pretending anymore. Why? Because it's a beta test to manufacture consent. We're going to send all of our money over for weapons and military contractors, and you will be happy. You will own nothing and be happy. World Economic Forum, they are beta testing manufacturing consent right now, and you are doing it. Why? Because that is how the system is working. In fact, they use different regulators as well. BaFin, the Germany regulator, they just blocked a USDE. So they're saying America can have the stable coins, but Europeans can't. So let's see, can Galaxy Digital do it? Because they just settled after being involved in a pump and dump? We shall see. But in Europe, they're using the German regulators in order to block stable coins because they want to launch the digital euro first. They created MiCA regulations. These rules are to ensure that there are no competition to the euro and they can time it. Will they allow the European stablecoin to go? What did Tether do? Tether said, we can't comply with that. We're going to not do that. And so they decided to focus on the dollar because with the dollar, you can bribe the politicians, the prostitutes, and get your cut of the future of the dollar and asset strip it with Bitcoin. So Europe wants full CBDC control when you follow the money. And so they're beta testing the digital euro in October, as we covered. So anyway, Remember, we need to make sure that you understand self-custody, you understand Bitcoin, you get the benefit from that rather than giving it to the stablecoin issuers. Your wallets, they want your wallets, they want your behavior, they want your spending patterns, they want all of the programmatic control, all of your social data, so that in real time they can say if they want to do an operation, they can literally shut off your money, negative interest rate, your behavior, full command and control, either to the technocrat, the central banksters in Europe, or in the US model, basically the back doors, the over operation, overtly do a CBDC in Europe, but covertly do it through NSA backdoor into CIA, into the central bank at the very top. And so, this is what is the lobbies fighting for right now? Well, Senator, let me make sure I get the right name here. Gillibrand, the Department of New York, he said in these stablecoin bills that they want to ban yield-bearing stablecoins to protect the banks. What is the power of the fractional reserve system? It is a monopoly into the Federal Reserve System. They want the yield because they can borrow and they can take out the debt-based Ponzi scheme from Treasury, and they get to charge on top, and they get to get the clip. If you issue a stablecoin backed by treasuries direct from Treasury, and you can pass on that yield like the beta test stablecoins have had right now, then why would you ever have a savings product at a bank when you could actually have a digital dollar that is programmatically through your own wallet convertible into Bitcoin through the yield? You wipe out the fractional reserve model. So of course the banks are lobbying for it. They want to control the stable coins, and they want to keep their special subsidy so that they can keep the Ponzi scheme going of wiping out middle-class America and being closer to the Federal Reserve System to get the 0% interest rate money, so that then they can convert their yield into Bitcoin and not you. If you win that battle, that is a controlled demolition of the fractional reserve system. This is a giant leap forward, because what they are doing by keeping the yield is perpetuating crony capitalism, fake capitalism based upon a debt-based Ponzi scheme of the Federal Reserve and the shareholding banks of the Federal Reserve. They know that a stable coin that can pay yield, that is the biggest attack to their model. And what do the technocrats want? The technocrats want to keep the yield as well. They want to asset strip America in this transition, and they want to do it. Why? They're backed by global capital as well. Global capital is invested across BRICS, across the global south, across the Middle Eastern regions. It is UAE, Qatari, Saudi, Emirati money that is invested in these people. And so they're using their financial control of capital in order to exert influence over these implants. They get to get rich at the same time, and you just need to understand the psyop and not fall for the politicians that are essentially paid as prostitutes to put the narrative that makes it acceptable to Europeans, Americans, and other regions in order to manufacture consent for this wealth confiscation. Don't rely on them. I mean, if they do the right thing, great. But the system is engineered. They don't even know who they work for half the time. Their boss is funded by another boss, and their boss sits at the top, and it comes down through the proof of weapons network, as I covered in previous videos. And then they lobby and bribe politicians. So who did the banking lobby bribe? Elizabeth Warren was the infamous cartoon character that executed Operation Choke Point 2.0, a Fed policy under Jerome Powell, that is sitting there saying all nice, prim, proper, Trump's the crazy person. It's not my job to say that, because he knows he's layer 1 and Trump is layer 3. Layer 3 sits under layer 1. And if you need to eliminate Trump, you bribe them through an Epstein network. You use lobby power, Senate and Congress, or you eliminate through assassination, which is where the intelligence come in, which is executing the vision of layer 1. So Elizabeth Warren, an agent for the banking lobby, is basically saying that stablecoins trying to make it a partisan issue so it doesn't get through. So there are factions of the proof of weapons network is seeing if they can still fight against it. They can keep the special subsidy. But if that doesn't work, then you can hand it over to the technocrats, and they're already shareholders in the technocrats, and they've diversified through managing capital into ensuring that you can give an America first narrative, but you need to look after yourself and understand this transition. They're basically trying to turn the dollar, as I said, into programmatic money controlled by technocrats, powered by artificial intelligence. And Trump is the person that needs to get all the rare earth minerals, the manufacturing base to rebuild robotics within America, the artificial intelligence, and everything that the people that pay for Trump need in order to usher in this technocracy. It's crony capitalism. Don't believe narratives. It is CBDCs, but with tech bros as the issuers, as well as banksters, and they're trying to hold on to the super subsidy. But if not, they're hedging with this subsidy. And if that whole system implodes, they're hedging with the people that they've been siphoning off the wealth to and investing in different regions. These are not America first. Understand, it is still globalism. While America is saying, we're no longer going to globalize, we're going to focus on our own, and you're going to be building it for these people. And you just need to understand the game so that you can get on the right side of the change rather than the wrong side of the change. Stable coins at this point are inevitable. I've been talking about it for years. In 2011, I wrote about transitioning to the debt-based Ponzi scheme. I wrote a book called Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. Go to simondixon.com, click that yellow button. You can get a copy of it for free in my Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And in 2011, I said, eventually the end scheme of communism on a blockchain is that you end up with a digital non-debt-based deleveraging system. And this is it. And this is the transition. So this is inevitable. It's predictable. It's guaranteed when you have a debt-based Ponzi scheme and a credit-based fractional reserve system backing up. And that's why the Bank of England created it in the first place. And there were other iterations of it in the past as well. But the Bank of England was the iteration that we have today. Anyway, they're trying to take over bank deposits and hedging their bets as well. It will replace SWIFT. It will replace bank accounts. It will potentially take out the Fed itself if it needs to. And it will hedge that model and make you think you're winning as you're doing it. Because remember, when an asset is no longer useful for the proof of weapons network, it gets rid of that asset. Just like when I cover in the geopolitical section, Israel, the jurisdiction that was created for much of these criminal networks, I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the government and the intelligence, it has outweighed its utility. And I'll go through why that is happening in the geopolitical section. When it outlives its utility, it can go. When the Fed is no longer needed, it can go. You replace it with something else. It is fluid in order to confiscate wealth and hand it over to those on the right side of the proof of weapons network. It's backed up by violence, and we can now peacefully, ethically opt out by owning Bitcoin in self-custody and beat the debt slavery that is the design of the fiat currency proof of weapons network. These stable coins will be used for payments. There'll be QR codes on everybody's device. It is happening. Don't think that this is some crazy thing. This is happening. It's going to exist on proof of stake networks, which is why those proof of stake networks have ETFs so that BlackRock can accumulate and stake so that they can control the proof of stake networks. This is why we save in Bitcoin, because what we want to do is spend in stable coins because we can't take currency risk in this transition phase, and use the yield by us having the yield to convert it into Bitcoin rather than give the stablecoin issuers the special subsidy. So everybody should be lobbying against that effort because the technocrats ain't going to do it. They want the Bitcoin subsidy, just like Tether's got it. The banks aren't going to do it. They want the Bitcoin subsidy. And they are deploying the bank power network to ensure that you can't get the yield. There are yield-bearing stablecoins right now. If lawfare can be used to work for consumer protection, the yield will be passed on to the consumer. Boom. We are in that peaceful transition. We don't need all the violence, and we can manage a peaceful transition and save in Bitcoin. The countries that want to protect themselves, they can use the same strategy. I'll go through some of the tools that were being presented to people as well, but never forget, don't forget that they will want to weaponize it, which is why you limit your exposure to it. It will eventually be run by artificial intelligence. It'll be linked to a digital ID, and it will be priced in surveillance, which is being beta tested on Europe and will come to America as well. So what are the companies doing to protect themselves? Well, I believe that there is a company, and you know my theory. My theory is that MicroStrategy, now called Strategy, has become important enough to the proof of weapons network that it is building a fiat currency nightmare to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible. And it has now accumulated 500 Bitcoin, so that if the Fed or if the proof of weapons network ever wanted to control demolition it through controlling the fiat currency network, or the technocrats want to do it through their AI, then you can create a correction in the market that creates a leverage type of situation that leads to some kind of event that can be nationalized, and the government can, like they did in 33 with the over leveraging, investing through the stock market, the bucket shops, over leverage a system, control rates, control demolition, go into the Great Depression, and then FDR confiscated all of the gold off the American people. Here's a neo way of doing it via Bitcoin when Bitcoin becomes a strategic asset. And so understand that. I believe that MicroStrategy, or now called Strategy, because it this week just announced that it has now acquired another 22,048 Bitcoin worth $1.92 billion at an average price of 86,969 per Bitcoin into the correction, and now holds 528,184 Bitcoin, and is coming up with ever more complex cap table and exotic instruments in order to support companies that want to transition into a Bitcoin treasury. And they're even creating, as I said last week, ETFs that will invest in all of them. So your pension has to invest in ETFs. BlackRock then says, you have to go here. Those ETFs then have to invest in these different products. And then they have to invest in the companies that are doing treasuries. And then they can have this mechanism. And all you have to do is protect yourself by owning in self-custody. That's a good thing. So what other companies are doing it? Now, the Indian companies, now that the Indian company has done kind of the final back and forth, we had the China back and forth, we had the Indian back and forth. Now they're recognizing, because the game theory of America saying it's going to do a revenue neutral Bitcoin strategic reserve, all of the countries are recognizing we need to adjust to this new reality. So there are public companies in India now, one of them called Jet King, sorry if I'm saying that. They're now raising money to purchase Bitcoin, and they're doing a beta test, just like we had the beta test in Japan, in India, in Hong Kong, based upon strategy, setting up the beta test. Then we'll have ETFs that can invest in it. There is no stopping this train. And so what is the Trump family doing? Well, they're taking organizations like Hut 8, which engage in infrastructure for Bitcoin mining. And they said, give us a new subsidiary. We'll put our brand on it. You give us a bunch of Bitcoin mining, and we'll create the largest American mining company. The Trump administration says, Hut 8, partner with us, Eric Trump, and American data centers across the region, and we will launch American BTC. We'll put American BTC caps on, and they will start. These are alignment of interests. All you need to do is stop listening to them and see what they're actually doing and follow the money, and you can get through this. So now American BTC is aiming to becoming the world's largest and most efficient pure play miner. How are they going to do that? Crash the price of oil, get natural gas down, wipe out some of the oil manufacturers that can't do it, have allegiances with the cheaper manufacturers, i.e. the Middle East, You may not even be creating an independent base. You don't even know. This is asset stripping. Maybe the price of oil allows the oil manufacturers within America to stay and survive, but please hedge. If Trump's stated goal is to get the price of oil down, to get the price of gas down, to cartel inflation, then what are the oil manufacturers, the drill baby drills, going to be able to do? They're going to go bankrupt. That's why allegiances are being formed with the Middle Eastern region, because maybe they're not going to be oil dependent. I've got no idea what they're exactly going to do. I just need to follow the money, look at the price of oil, do the maths, recognize that America cannot produce at the cheap rate that OPEC can. So therefore, Trump needs to form alliances with who? Putin, MBS. So now the narrative then works in, says, oh, Putin is no longer Hitler, by the way. We need to work with our allies. What does that mean for American manufacturers? It's all you need to do is follow the flows. It's fluid. Things go wrong, but you just got to follow the flows, not listen to what they're saying, and then you can get ahead of the system. Anyway, so what are they going to be doing? They said they're going to be building a robust Bitcoin strategic reserve within the new subsidiary of Hut 8 that is owned partially by the Trump family. And so they can get their free Bitcoin mining position and they can adjust it. The global capital providers around the world are all hedging against the dollar and buying Bitcoin. The central banks are all buying up gold and hedging against the dollar. The Trump tariffs are driving a regional superpower and artificial intelligence power in order to give the technocrats what they need to usher in this change. This is not about middle-class America. It is the same system dressed up in a different. It is a transition because so much money was taken from middle-class America and Europeans and invested in the countries that were actually investing in their people. China was building out massive infrastructure. China was investing in global South when America was blowing them up. And that is why these new allegiances have been formed. And so who's the next company on the public stock market that's going to play the fiat currency system and get into Bitcoin? GameStop. Who's GameStop? GME. GME was a company that was speculative attacked by a massive member Citadel of the proof of weapons network that does corporate raiding through shorting, through controlling capital at cheap rates. They could borrow from the Bank of Japan if they want at 0%, hedge out the currency exposure, and then they get to use and launch speculative attacks by shorting companies, wipe out retail that want to sell, do naked shorting, and then they get to take out companies. And there was an attack against it by retail that was able to use Robinhood, a company that I invested in, that eventually went public. And then there was a whole investigation with the SEC, why they put off the bid. Were they doing it for Citadel? Were they doing it for the SEC? Who knows? That investigation happened. But this company now ends up with about $4 billion of capital and is now raising capital in order to buy Bitcoin after meeting Michael Saylor to do the treasury Bitcoin reserve asset and taking a company that has these reserves and essentially creating a new model rather than going into Chapter 11, rather than restructuring where lawyers get to steal all the money. You can now transition through Michael Saylor into turning it into a Bitcoin treasury company. And then maybe you can take that and do SPACs where you reverse merge other companies that now have these Bitcoin positions. And you can now save the company into a zombie company using Bitcoin. The shareholders don't have to go through the asset stripping. And you can do a better model. This is what happens when you create hard money. You actually get a reversing of the asset stripping predatory model of those that can borrow from the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And instead, you get to take those very same zombie companies, save them with Bitcoin, and create a new future for somebody that needs to shell public company with a Bitcoin treasury reserve. This is the beauty of changing time preference and utilizing at the corporate level. So GME, GameStop, was up about 15% just upon the announcement. Now, obviously, it corrected with the stock market because of the Trump tariffs that we'll be covering. But GameStop has now raised $1.48 billion just before the correction. And it's now got $6.08 billion in order to acquire Bitcoin and develop their treasury strategy. They can join the Bitwise Treasury ETF, which is all the public companies using debt-based instruments in order to wipe out those, in order to play the arbitrage between fiat currency and Bitcoin. And it can become a strategic company in case America wants to use the Federal Reserve to hike or crash rates and then nationalize it and end up with that Bitcoin as well, as the dollar system potentially capitulates. It's all about hedging. So what did Trump do? Trump Media then signs an agreement with a partner with a Chinese company called Crypto.com. It has a subsidiary in America, but it was launched from China in order to launch Bitcoin ETFs so that they can get their cut from Bitcoin. What else did the Trump administration do? It signed an executive order to empower U.S. Treasury, not the Federal Reserve, U.S. Treasury, to modernize the payment system. So basically it's saying, it frames it as narrative, which is, we're stamping out corruption and we're going to give everybody $5,000, the subsidy from what we change at Doge. Elon gets all of his data. And you get to do an executive order saying that, right, we need to do the monetary system. What's it going to pay with? Trump stablecoin, Elon stablecoin, the Mellon family stablecoin. What does Trump say the executive order is to reduce fraud. So upgrading the treasury payment system, no, it's in order to transition to the stablecoin standard. They'll say to you, reduce fraud, reduce waste, reduce abuse. But here's how you know whether they're real and out for the American people. Will they allow you to get the yield and convert it into Bitcoin, or will they take the subsidy? Because if they take the subsidy, they're just essentially asset stripping America, repurposing the Ponzi scheme and wiping out middle-class America so they can take as much Bitcoin out of the system. Follow the money, you can understand what's happening. Then you know whether it is MAGA, whether it's real or not. MAGA means that you get the yield and you get to convert it into Bitcoin. So what about the regulators? So we have the OCC. They're doing their lobby under the Fed. Well, there's the smaller banks. The smaller banks are regulated by FDIC. These are the ones where they could just wipe you out. This wiped out Silicon Valley Bank. They took over your bank in a weekend, and then they hand you over to the too big to fail banks, and then you end up in JP Morgan, just like they did during the 2022, Silicon Valley Bank wipeout and Signature and Silvergate. FDIC has come out, and what they're doing, they said, we're revising the banks, and we're now allowing banks to engage in crypto related activities. And you don't need to ask FDIC for permission. So this is the free banking era that we talked about. Will they keep the yield? Will they pass on the yield? That is the key question. That is the number one question of whether you know that this is going to be an attack on the system and they're doing it for middle-class Americans, or whether they're doing it for themselves. That's how you know. You've got to have these key things where you understand so that you don't fall for their narratives. BlackRock is launching a Bitcoin exchange traded product in Europe. So wash, rinse, repeat. Beta test was America. You basically get BlackRock ETF in Europe. BlackRock then gets all of its buddies in Europe, all of its banksters, all of its proof of weapons network, gets them all in. Then the regulations come out, and then you have holding down of the system. And then you have the original agenda as well. So BlackRock is getting all of its clients into Bitcoin in Europe, while it is pushing a narrative. What is BlackRock saying? So he's a key, Larry Fink is a key player on the proof of weapons network. BlackRock is pushing a narrative that Bitcoin is replacing the US dollar as reserve. He's saying that narrative for a reason, because he's invested in all the other regions as well. BlackRock's not America first. You might think it is, just because it's tradable on the US stock market. But Look at its balance sheet. Look at its assets. It is fully diversified. It's a global financial institution on the proof of weapons network. The proof of weapons network is to asset strip companies, wipe out the middle class in order to use central banking and intelligence operations to make sure that they wipe out the money from you. And now when they go into the adjustment process, the central banks buy gold and the buddies buy Bitcoin, and they transition to the new world order. Right. One thing that was very interesting as well, one of the pieces of the fund managers on the network came out and said, how does America protect itself in this environment? There was a speech that came out, very interesting. And essentially it was from a fund manager. And they said that US, I don't know if he was a fund manager or an investment bankster that constructs projects. But he basically said US could fund Bitcoin buys with a $2 trillion bit bond. Now, we launched in 2014 the first bit bonds. We launched the first Bitcoin, Bank to the Future, launched the first Bitcoin VC funds. And we backed them by mining as well. And we created retirement Bitcoin products as well. The Bitbond brand has come back now by TradFi. And so TradFi wants to launch a $2 trillion bit bond, and it's by a financial institution called New Market. And the CEO came out and gave a presentation, a very interesting presentation. What it said is that you could raise finance through a bond, through a traditional financial market bond, just like the treasury strategy for companies like Strategy, but you could do it at the government treasury level. And so you can dedicate, essentially, you take a bond, you do a fundraise, you raise $2 trillion, and you dedicate 10% of the issuant proceeds to buying Bitcoin. So of a $2 trillion raise, it would be $200 billion of the $2 trillion that goes out and buys Bitcoin in the market. You purchase the Bitcoin, and then the remaining 90% is used in order to fund regular government which basically means roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. They never invest in US infrastructure. They transfer the money back to the banking lobby, the big pharma lobby, the military industrial complex, their war operations like Israel lobby in the Middle East, which is no longer useful based upon what we'll be covering in the geopolitical macro section. But essentially, governments can continue the Ponzi scheme and they can asset strip Bitcoin out of the process as they're doing it as well. And so essentially, this socializes Bitcoin upside. So this is an interesting strategy. It keeps the debt-based Ponzi scheme for longer, but it also gives everyday Americans that their pensions invest in these products some of the upside of Bitcoin. Again, a peaceful transition rather than a sudden transition. But basically, the bonds would pay a lower current interest rate. So he suggested 1% on the first 10 years. So now, while you restructure the debt, you replace it with 1% bonds that has 10% allocated to Bitcoin. Now you've reduced the rate down to 1% if you do this strategy. And you offset the final payout to bondholders by giving them some guaranteed annualized return of about 4.5%. But also on top of that, that's on a senior basis, you share the BTC price rise. So the appreciation goes to the issuer, Treasury, and 50% of it stays with the issuer, and 50% goes to the upside. Now, he did some estimations based upon the previous upside of Bitcoin, where if you can guarantee the 4.5%, only pay 1% for the next 10 years, you can get the type of Bitcoin upside that has happened. Then you can, you can essentially get the upside and share that with the pension companies that buy that, which obviously BlackRock will control, and the various other components of the proof of weapons network. And basically, the government would end up retaining half of the gains. And he gave some examples. And basically, after accounting for the $200 billion purchase of Bitcoin, based upon the previous returns, he calculated that there would be a net present value saving of $354 billion in this $200 trillion asset. It could be structured as revenue neutral, which means it doesn't need to go by Congress based upon the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Executive Order that Trump has already put in place, which means you could reprice gold, sell some of the gold, and buy and issue these treasuries and use that to buy some Bitcoin. It could be done revenue neutral as per the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Executive Order. But the overall tax cost to taxpayers would be completely offset by the lower interest rate. So he's worked through that. He argued that essentially this might be able to be used to reduce the 10-year rate. The 10-year rate is the rate that the Fed doesn't control, the price of government borrowing, for 10 years. That reduces it down to 1% for that tranche of the issuance. This could essentially bring down the borrowing cost for mortgages, using a similar product. He argues that it would bring down the cost for auto loans, for small businesses that need to gain access to finance as stable coins transition to helicopter money to get universal basic income based upon the savings, to transition to a technocracy so you can get 350 million Americans to adopt it so Elon can implement his social credit score, so that you can have people cheering on because they got America, the Fed got America into $37 trillion of debt. So he argues that essentially this is for everyday Americans to build wealth using Bitcoin, using Bitbonds. This is essentially the only real solution for how to create a competing asset to the debt. Because remember, the Federal Reserve System, the dollar is debt. You can't pay down the $37 trillion of debt. You can only roll it over. So you have to roll it over into assets that might appreciate more than the Federal Reserve System. It's probably the only strategy that can be used in order to actually create something that might be able to restructure this in a controlled demolition. So what have we covered today in This Week in Bitcoin? Stable coins, if they pass on the yield, can give everyday Americans the opportunity to protect themselves from the proof of weapons network. Public companies can use, and private companies could use the same strategy of the Bitcoin treasury strategy in order to make sure you don't get wiped out as the debt-based Ponzi scheme rolls over. And treasury can do the same as it's engaging in these battles through Bitbonds. There are three strategies: individuals, corporations, and government, if they want to go through a controlled demolition. Will the Federal Reserve Proof of Weapons Network allow that to happen? Well, let's look through and follow the money of the Trump administration and understand what these damn tariffs are all about. I could be wrong, I could be right, but I follow the money and I will adjust based each week based upon what the evidence shows me. So now we're going to move into part 2 this week in macro, and we're going to be covering the Trump tariffs. So do me a favor, if you enjoyed part 1, I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers because YouTube started censoring me, and I want to get a blue tick, which you can only get. I don't want a blue chick, I want a blue tick. I'm a married man. I don't want an avatar. I would like a tick so that I can get YouTube to review my account now that everything I've said that they used to censor me for being conspiracy theories can be backed up by evidence. So if you're not a subscriber, if everyone that watches this video went over to my YouTube channel, Simon Dixon, and I'll keep giving this content for free, but if all of you subscribed, I'd get over that 100,000, then I can get that review, then I can get organic traffic, and we can make this shit happen. The more we get the message out, the more they can protect themselves. Just given a strategy for everyday Americans beaten by the Proof of Weapons Network. Everyday corporations beaten by the Proof of Weapons Network. Even Treasury and government in protecting itself when becoming a regional power, rather than getting wiped out and asset stripped like Europe right now. Even the individual European countries can do that. Get this message out there. Companies, countries can protect themselves. I need you support so that we can actually get real traffic now that I'm being censored. With that in mind, I'm just going to have a little bit of water, and I'm going to go over to This Week in Macro, and in part 3, we're going to do This Week in Geopolitics. We've got a lot to cover because I did 2 weeks. Right. Hit that like button, share right now. 1, 2, 3.